Welcome. Here's another short audio piece talking about Marxism, this time Marxism's relationship with Satanism and also how that compares to Christianity as well. So in my book, Red Pandemic, The Global Marxist Cult, I've got a section talking about the importance of Christianity for Western civilization, that Christianity is one of the pillars of the West, capitalism, Christianity, culture, and the traditional family unit. And communism has always been anti-Christianity overall. And it's obvious to see the historical examples, the persecution of Christians in the Bolshevik regime in the Soviet Union post-1917, the Holodomor genocide, the Spanish Civil War, and more examples of anti-Christian hatred. We had Red China's persecution of monks in Tibet, their persecution of the Falun Gong, which is the pretty harmless spiritual meditation group in China, and they used those Falun Gong members for organ harvesting, which is quite horrific. And also the fact that they used the Uyghur Muslims as slaves in the Xinjiang province, autonomous zone, for slave labor and so on. So there's countless examples of this anti-Christianity all through communism. The desecration of churches and temples shows this anti-religious, particularly anti-Christian side to communism. And in the section of the book where I talk about destruction of the church and religion, here's a few quotes from the book. Quote, "Socialism is precisely the religion that must overwhelm Christianity." Antonio Gramsci, Prison Notebooks, 1929 to 1935. Another one, quote, "We communists are like Judas. It is our bloody work to crucify Christ, but this sinful work is at the same time our calling. Only through death on the cross does Christ become God, and this is necessary to be able to save the world. We communists then take the sins of the world upon us in order to be able to thereby to save the world." Georgy Lukács in Communist Hungary, 1919. Another one, quote, "Communism is that stage of historical development which makes all existing religions superfluous and supersedes them." End quote. Friedrich Engels, The Communist Question of Faith, 1847. And finally, quote, "Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of the heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people." End quote. Karl Marx, Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, 1844. So this hatred of Christianity as well has been all through Karl Marx's work from his poem Human Pride. Quote, "With disdain I will throw my gauntlet full in the face of the world and see the collapse of this pygmy giant whose fall will not stifle my ardour. Then I will wander godlike and victorious through the ruins of the world, and, giving my words an active force, I will feel equal to the Creator." End quote. So there we can see clearly that Marx wasn't atheist. He believed in God, but he was anti-God. That's a big difference. So communism has a reputation of being atheistic, but the truth of it really is that it's satanic. And this is something that more and more people are catching on to. But when we say satanic, what does that mean? People have different interpretations. They might have limited knowledge. Certainly a person, if they're, say, a Christian, for example, they would be very familiar with this concept coming from the Bible, being aware of what Satan is. But what is Satanism? Now, before we get into more detail, anybody can be satanic, even Christians. A person can identify as whatever they want in this life, but their actions, their behavior can be satanic. So for example, the idea of being service to self, being more self-orientated and being more concerned with yourself than looking after other people is satanic. Another kind of element of Satanism is the idea of denial, the denial of godly or universal morality, that there's no such thing as universal right or wrong. And connected in with that, the idea of moral relativism, or psychopathy in other words, the idea of a person making up their own version of what's right and what's wrong, which obviously allows a person to engage in harmful or negative behavior because they can just invent what they think is right or wrong. It's really all about what's good for them, back to the service to self and kind of narcissism thing. Another element to Satanism is the idea of being against God or against God's plan for the world. Now, I appreciate a lot of you, they might not believe in God, you might not be religious, It doesn't really matter if someone's atheist or they're Christian. We're all dealing with what globalism is doing to the world. You don't have to be Christian to fight globalism, but certainly Christians have an advantage in understanding the satanic side of all this. So being against God's plan or being against nature or the natural order is another way of putting it. Satanism is against those things, and being against those things, being against the natural order and God's plan, it tends to create chaos and destruction, which is exactly what Marxism does. Also, there's the satanic idea that human beings are no good, that God made a mistake, that humanity doesn't deserve to be here in a sense. That's kind of Satan's perspective in a sense. Another example is, a person, they're having their life dedicated towards hatred and not love. Well, hatred is the idea of can generate negative energy and cause harm to other people. So if a person dedicates their life towards hatred and not love, that is just another example of being more satanic than being godly in a sense. So like I said, Christians have an advantage in understanding this stuff, but they're also quite limited in knowledge because they won't really go outside the Bible and other Christian books. They won't study into the occult, or they certainly wouldn't understand Satanism and looked into that. So they've got quite limited knowledge. So if you look at the Bible, you remember, what was the devil's brief? Well, the devil was kind of like not equal to God, but a subordinate of God, right? I can't remember the passages, but remember how God was almost like the boss, and the devil was carrying out a mission for God of being the opposer. So the word Satan, I think it's from the Hebrew or the Sanskrit word shatan, meaning opposer. Right, so opposing what? Well, opposing God's plan. So Satan was also known as being the tempter, the slanderer, the deceiver, not just of Jesus, but of humanity in general. So, tempting Jesus in the desert when he was fasting, but not just that, but of tempting humanity in general. Now, again, it doesn't matter if you believe in God or the devil or you believe in this stuff. Look at what's happening in the world right now, and you can see this satanic influence coming in through all the stuff that Marxism does. We'll get into examples of that later. But basically, if you remember, Satan's brief was not necessarily to destroy human beings, but to get them to destroy themselves with their own free will. That's a big difference, and that's really at the heart of this, because you look at Marxist brainwashing, it turns people into anti-humans. It brainwashes them in such a way that they actually believe that destruction is benevolent, or being anti-life and being anti-God's creation, that those things are good and not evil, right? So we'll get to inversion in a moment, but for an example of what I'm talking about, abortion is clearly an example of something that's been pushed by Marxism via the feminist movement that's against creation, and that's actually death. You couldn't get a better example of something that's more satanic than abortion. It's an act that a human being can do, which is more about themselves than about giving and about creating life, and it's against God, and it's obviously against nature, because it's obviously natural for women to give birth, but it's unnatural to have an abortion. So this is why Marxism traditionally, the communist movement, has been against Christianity, because Christianity, even though it may have been distorted in some ways, and some of it's up for debate in many ways, it is generally good for Western civilization. And even though there might, say the Catholic Church, which we'll get to a bit later, has been, a representative of Christianity, and so many others have been different interpretations of Christianity, but in general, Christianity represents the natural order, universal morality, the creation, etc., and the creator. So, but Satanism, then another element of Satanism is the idea of turning all that upside down. Inversion and deception, turning things upside down. So an example of that would be feminism, and also the trans movement. Feminism as, turning traditional gender roles upside down, encouraging women to be more dominant and aggressive and more egotistical and less timid and feminine, and encouraging men to be more timid, passive, to let women take control more, and so on. So that's the example of the inversion I'm talking about, and as we've seen, the results of that have been catastrophic. By allowing women to become more dominant and aggressive, it's bad for them, it's bad for society, it's bad for global affairs, and so on, because they're just not suited to it. And men are obviously, when men become more timid, recessive, pacifist, that's bad as well, because they should be taking the lead, particularly when it comes to the defense of nations and the defense of their families and communities and so on. We also have, the inversion in the trans movement, right? The inversion of gender. We've seen that quite clearly. They're literally trying to make male into female, female into male. And they've used, the trans movement through hormone replacement therapy and gender, sexual reassignment surgery, and all this bullshit to try to go against God's plan, go against nature. And one of the oldest examples of the natural order in humanity is male and female. And we've seen, thanks to not just the trans movement, but the modern age with our processed food diets, lack of animal fats, less sunshine, sugars, drugs, everything else, and the internet and radio waves, microwaves, all this stuff has affected the genetics of human beings as well. And it's all that stuff has an impact on hormones and gender. It's not just the trans movement. And we've seen basically in this age that God's plan and the natural order has been distorted because of the modern age and what Marxism has done. Another kind of element here of this, which is Satanism, which will resonate hopefully to the audience, is Satanism is the idea of encouraging base emotions in people, or to bringing out the hatred, the envy, the weakness, the arrogance, of creating chaos and destruction rather than harmony. Satanism is about all of that, causing divisions, and Marxism does all of that. It brings out all of that stuff through the indoctrination. It encourages human beings to be shitty human beings, pretty much, right? And a lot of this knowledge comes from the world of the occult, right, which is kind of, occult is from the occultari, or oculus meaning eye. Occultari in Latin is hidden from the eye or hidden from sight. So occult knowledge just is nothing to do with cults. Occult means hidden knowledge. This is the kind of knowledge that is not so much mainstream. It comes more from the conventional religions. It comes from other sources, shall we say. I personally kind of had an interest in this stuff because I believed in the New World Order and global elites and Satanism and secret societies, and I believed that those things existed, and I wanted to understand my enemy. So I spent a bit of time looking into these subjects, and this is where a lot of these concepts come from. So Satanism, again, one of the things it does is it brings out the worst in people and causes division and hate. An example of how Marxism does that is the whole socialism thing. Marxist socialism, the whole thing of we need to take from the rich and give to the poor. And what does that do? It makes the poor seem oppressed. The rich are the oppressors. And once you have that class struggle, and you put one person in the oppressed class and the other in the oppressor class tend to become a target, and they become on the receiving end of a lot of violence. And that's exactly what's happened in the history of communism. And how does all that work? Well, Marxism, because it has this satanic element to it, it encourages envy and hatred between those who don't have that much and those who have a lot more. And then the results we're plain to see, the destruction of civilizations, economic collapse, famine, genocide, and so on. That's how the so-called communist regimes of the 20th century was able to kill so many people. Yes, war, invasion, murder killed a lot of people and so on, but executions, but it was mostly starvation from governments that caused all that. And what did all that? Well, they were able to, state control, and they broke up society. They tried to remove the classes, take from the rich, give to the poor. And how people got on board with that was because of the satanic influence of Marxism. Their negative, aggressive emotions, their sense of disenfranchisement was encouraged in the beginning. And that's what led to all that death and destruction, one of the factors. Another thing which is quite satanic attached into Marxism is this notion of the people having gargantuan egos, believing that their purpose in this life is mainly to save the world in some way. It might be to save the women in feminism, to save the animals in veganism, to save the planet with climate change movement, which is one of the funniest examples of what I'm talking about. The idea that we are going to save the world is the height of arrogance. It's the opposite to humility or being humble. And Marxism has always encouraged that out of control ego. And as I pointed out as well, the out of control ego is not just restricted to people in that category of what we would call the political left or the liberals, progressive that they're erroneously called. They're all just Marxist cult members. But the ego is not just within that group. You can also get people with gargantuan egos on the political right as well. And I've been saying this for quite a while. People having these massive egos that they believe they are the ones who have the best answers, and they're going to come forward and lead us all and save our countries from being destroyed because of what this globalist system is doing. So this ego, like I said, Satanism is something that can contaminate people right across society. Relate to that as well as fear. So I was talking about Satanism bringing out people's the lower characteristics of human beings. There's lots of different types of courage, there's different types of fear. There's the fear of, being afraid of getting into a physical altercation. It can be a little bit disconcerting for people who've never been punched in the face before, or, being in the middle of a war zone or something. There's different types of fear, the fear of things like public speaking and so on. But a very important type of fear to talk about is inner fear, specifically the fear for you to self-criticize or to accept criticism from others. Because if you're afraid of that, it stops you from evolving as an individual, and it leads a person to becoming mentally weak or unevolved, or immature is another way of saying it. And if a person doesn't really evolve in this life, that leads them to have stupid thoughts, stupid actions. They end up being a liability to people around them, or a social parasite is another way of saying it. So they end up becoming unevolved. That's Satanism, the idea of human beings not evolving and becoming a low quality human being, regardless of their age. And obviously connected in with that then is people with grandiose egos, or narcissists, are usually cowards internally. They're afraid to face up to the truth about themselves and their limitations, or to face up to their issues. So in order to compensate for that, they project this idea of being having strength or being a warrior, etc. It's just fakery. It's not real toughness. And so that is really Satanism in action. When people don't have the courage to evolve as individuals, and they become imbalanced, and they become a low quality human being who's usually bad for themselves and bad for people around them. Now, there's a reason why communist movement has been against the Catholic Church. Of course, like I said, it's not the only denomination of Christianity on the planet, but the Catholic Church is also the biggest Christian organization on the planet. It's been very, very influential throughout human history, and that's why the communist movement has been very keen to attack it at every opportunity. So we have to ignore the corruptions within it and look at what the church overall was promoting for most of its history till Marxism started to really impact on it in the 20th century. It's the largest Christian organization in the world, highly influential, and it promoted traditional family values. There were certain ideas within Catholicism or Christianity in general that were good for civilization. The ideas of the traditional family unit of man and woman, the idea of producing children and having a family, the idea of respecting nature, looking after the land, of being prosperous and so on. These are all the kind of ideas that were encouraged not just in the Bible, but in Christianity as a whole. Now, it's no coincidence that in the 20th century, I mentioned before about the communist movements pretty much making a beeline for Christians, destroying churches, massacring Christians, committing horrible acts of satanic violence against Christians all through the history. But then we also have the feminist movement, in the 20th century in particular, when the different waves of feminism came along, particularly from the 1960s onwards, the feminist movement was getting a bit more brazen and started to oppose the church on things like the church's views on contraception, on abortion and so on, which opened the floodgates to abortion becoming normalized, which again is Satanism. So anything that gets in the way of life being created can be interpreted as being satanic, whether it's contraception or abortion and so on. And the feminist movement has done other things, like it's had a massive impact on the traditional family unit, it's normalized divorce, etc., etc. You can see all those examples there are plain to see. And I mentioned the trans movement, how it inverts gender, turns male into female, female into male, or tries to anyway. Obviously it's all nonsense, because the cells in your body, the millions of cells in your body, your DNA is imprinted on your cells, and you can get all the surgery and take all the hormones you want to. If you were born a male, you'll still be a male, and the same goes if you're a female. The trans movement, as we can see, destroys people's lives, not just psychologically, but destroys their bodies. It sterilizes people, which ties into the whole eugenics thing and population control, because it mostly affects white populations, people of European genetic stock. When you take hormone replacement therapy and have sexual or gender reassignment surgery, their bodies essentially become butchered, and then they end up not being able to have kids. That's Satanism. That's satanic undertones of Marxism. It's against God's creation. It's against nature, and it stops people from reproducing and creating more life. That's Satanism. So you can see the anti-life and anti-humanity undertones. It's not just about brainwashing and pop culture and trans activists. It's much deeper than all that. There's also the climate change movement as well, I mentioned, which is quite funny. It says that God made a mistake. God created humanity, and he just totally forgot that we were going to generate all these technologies to produce CO2, and that the planet would need to be saved and we'd have to start eating more leaves and all this nonsense. So the climate change movement is another example of this anti-God, anti-nature thing, and it says that we shouldn't use the animals for food, that we shouldn't use the resources on the planet like the fossil fuels and so on, that we should build these ungodly, unholy technologies like wind turbines and solar panels and all this crap to live on this planet. It's just there's a tremendous amount of arrogance at play here. And by the way, that's a very satanic thing as well, to say that we know better than the creator how things should go on this planet. It's all very satanic. And even with veganism as well, human beings, I don't want to go into too much of a tangent here, but I put this in the book, that it's very natural for human beings to eat animal products. It's very natural for us to do that. It's no coincidence now in the 20th century that we've never had bigger problems. We've never had problems like this before in our history, of people being anxiety and depression and lower birth rates and the lower testosterone levels and so on, and people having more early onset Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and so on. All these things a lot of it is connected in with our diets and the fact we don't eat animal products as much as we used to in the past. So veganism, again, is satanic because it's unnatural, it's against the natural order, and it suggests that we're not supposed to use the animals for food as God intended. So much more I could say on all that. As usual, thanks for listening. The website is resolvingor.com, so the letter R for Romeo, resolvingor.com. The book is Red Pandemic, The Global Marxist Cult, available on many different platforms, including Amazon, Barnes & Noble, etc. So you can check out the website for those links. Also, you can find the content on YouTube, TikTok, and a bunch of other platforms. And make sure you follow on X at resolvingor. Thank you very much for listening, and I will speak to you in the next one.